Maggie Holden drove the kitchen knife straight into the wooden table in front of Cole Hargrove. Hard enough to stick. Hard enough to stop every man in that room cold. And she looked him dead in the eye with 16 ranch hands watching and said, "I am not leaving this ranch until I've cooked one meal in that kitchen. You can throw me out after, but you will sit down and you will listen, because a dead woman sent me here, and I don't disappoint the dead." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Cole looked at the knife, looked at her. Then he sat down. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button right now and stay with this story all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that knife, still quivering in the wood, because what happened in the hours that followed changed every single person on Copper Ridge Ranch, and none of them saw it coming. The knife had not been part of the plan. Maggie had ridden 3 days through October cold to reach Copper Ridge Ranch with one intention: walk in quietly, show the letter, ask for a chance, cook one meal, and honor her aunt's last wish without making a scene. She was 34 years old, and she had spent 2 years perfecting the art of not making scenes. Then she'd walked through that front door. She'd found 16 men in the main room, some sitting, some leaning against walls, all of them staring at her, the way men stare at something they've already decided is temporary. The room smelled like 6 weeks of nobody caring. And Cole Hargrove had been standing at the far end with his arms crossed and his face closed. And before she could speak, he'd said, "Whatever you're selling, the answer is no. Turn around." That was when her hand found the knife on the side table. She wasn't proud of it, but she wasn't sorry either. "My name is Margaret Holden," she said, her voice carrying across the whole room. "Ruth Carey was my aunt. She worked your kitchen for 3 years. She died 6 weeks ago, and her last wish, her last written, witnessed, legally documented wish, was that I come to this ranch and cook one meal." She looked around at all of them. Now, I don't know what kind of men turn away a dead woman's final request, but I was raised to believe that said something about their character. So, who's hungry? The silence stretched. Then Junior Polk, 19 years old and constitutionally incapable of staying quiet, said from the back of the room, "I am. I'm real hungry. Been hungry for 6 weeks." Someone snorted. Someone else coughed to cover a laugh. And Cole Hargrove looked at the knife in his table, then at Maggie, and something moved across his face that was gone before she could name it. "Hector," he said. Hector Vasquez stepped out of the shadow by the far wall. He was 55, built like old oak, with eyes that had been making accurate judgments about people for decades. He looked at Maggie the way a man looks at a horse he's thinking about buying. Not unkindly, but without sentiment. "Show her the kitchen," Cole said. Hector looked at Maggie. "Follow me." She pulled the knife out of the table, set it down flat, and followed. Behind her, she heard Junior say, "I like her," and Cole say, "Nobody asked you," and Junior say, "Still, though," and she pressed her lips together and kept walking. The kitchen stopped her in the doorway, not because it was the worst she'd ever seen. She'd cooked in spaces that were barely a step above open ground. What stopped her was recognizing Ruth in the bones of it, the way the hooks were arranged, the particular height of the shelving, the small nail by the window where her aunt had always hung her apron. Ruth had built this kitchen into something, and then Ruth had gotten sick and left, and in 6 weeks it had caved in on itself like a house after a flood. Cold stove, rust on the pot handles, flour bin left open. "4 cooks since Ruth left," Hector said from behind her. "None lasted the week." What happened to them? Two walked out on their own. One decided ranch life wasn't to her taste after the first cold night. He paused. The last one, a man named Reeves, treated the hands like livestock, served them slop and expected gratitude. His voice was flat. The men helped him decide to leave. Maggie walked to the stove and checked the damper. I'm not going to serve slop. I know. She turned. You know? You just met me. Ruth wrote me letters from Laramie while she was sick. He said it simply, without drama. She described you well enough. Said you were the best cook she'd ever taught and the most stubborn person she'd ever loved. A pause. Said you'd come eventually. Knew you would. Maggie's throat tightened. She turned back to the stove before he could see her face do anything inconvenient. I need inventory. Root cellar, pantry, cold storage. And I need someone on water and fire. I'll send Junior. The boy who can't stop talking? The very one. Was that almost a smile? Hard to tell with Hector. He's useless and helpful in equal measure. You'll want to tell him to be quiet at the start, or he never will be. How much time do I have? Hector checked the window. 4 hours to supper. Then stop standing there and send me the boy. He left. Maggie rolled up her sleeves and started moving. The pantry was Ruth's handwriting on every label, neat and slightly right-slanted, and Maggie's hands slowed on each tin she touched without her permission. She made herself keep moving. Salt pork. Dried beans. Good ones, not weevilled. Cornmeal. Lard that was still sound. Onions and potatoes in the root cellar. She sent Junior down twice with a lamp and strict instructions about what to look for. Dried apple slices in a sealed jar on the top shelf. A bag of coffee someone had opened and then apparently forgotten existed for a month, which she considered a specific kind of sin. You're going to make real food? Junior said, appearing at her elbow for the 4th time. He had the energy of a dog that had been inside too long. Sandy hair, ears slightly too large, expression of a person who had not yet learned to conceal his emotions. Like actual food, not jerky. Cornbread, bean soup, apple cobbler. The sound he made was somewhere between a prayer and a sob. Junior. Ma'am? If you tell me you've been eating jerky for 6 weeks one more time, I'm going to make you eat it for 7. Get me a second pot from that back cabinet and stop hovering. Yes, ma'am. He got the pot. Hovered anyway, but quieter. She let it go. She was 2 hours in, beans simmering, cornbread batter ready for the skillets, when the kitchen door opened and a man walked in that she hadn't seen in the main room earlier. He was 40 or so, wide through the shoulders, with a face that had spent a lot of time outdoors and not much time being pleasant. He looked around the kitchen with the particular expression of a man looking for something to find fault with. You're the new cook, he said. Maggie Holden. She didn't look up from the cornmeal she was measuring. And you are? Denton. Boyd Denton. I've been on this ranch 11 years. He said it like those 11 years entitled him to something. We've had 4 cooks since Miss Ruth left. So I've heard. None of them worked out. Also heard that. He was quiet for a moment, recalibrating. What makes you think you're different? Maggie set down the measuring cup and looked at him directly. Boyd Denton was the kind of man she'd encountered in every camp and crew she'd ever worked. Not bad exactly, just territorial. Afraid that something changing meant something he had was going to be taken away. I don't think I'm different, she said. I think I'm here, I've got 4 hours, and I'm going to put food on that table tonight that reminds every man in this crew that someone in this building gives a damn whether they eat well or not. That's all. You want to stand in my kitchen and watch? You're welcome to it. You want to help? Grab that wooden spoon and start stirring that pot so it doesn't catch in the bottom." She turned back to her work. "You want to make trouble? Go make it somewhere that isn't my kitchen." The silence behind her lasted long enough that she thought he'd walked out. Then she heard him pick up the spoon. She didn't smile, but it was close. Junior looked like he might actually combust with the effort of not saying anything. By the time the sun was an hour from setting, the kitchen was a different place. Fire going strong, both burners occupied. The smell of beans and salt pork and browning cornbread moving through the air in a way that had Junior closing his eyes every few minutes, like he was in church. Boyd Denton had stopped stirring and started actually helping, fetching things she asked for without commentary, which she counted as progress. Hector came in at 5:30, looked around, said nothing, and went back out. Junior interpreted this. That means he's impressed. Hector doesn't say good things out loud. He just stopped saying bad things. "Stir the cobbler." "Yes, ma'am." At 6 o'clock exactly, she heard boots on the porch. Then more boots. Then the particular shuffling sound of men who want to go somewhere, but are being careful about it, which was the sound of 16 ranch hands who had been burned before and weren't sure yet whether tonight was different. They came in and sat down, the way cattle come through a gate when they're not sure what's on the other side. Close together, watchful. None of them first. Cole came in last and took the head of the table, and his face gave away absolutely nothing. The same closed, careful face he'd had since she arrived. And Maggie brought out the soup. The table went quiet. Not the polite quiet of people waiting. The specific quiet of people who have been handed something they didn't expect and aren't sure yet how to react to it. She'd seen it before. She knew what it meant. Hector picked up his spoon, dipped it, drank. He reached for the cornbread. That was the signal. 16 men started eating. For 30 seconds, there was nothing but the sound of spoons and the creak of the bench and the fire in the stove. Then a man at the far end of the table. She'd learned his name was Cal. He was 42 and hadn't smiled since his horse broke a leg in August. Picked up a piece of cornbread, bit into it, and said, "Lord Almighty," very quietly, to no one in particular. The man next to him said, "Don't talk, just eat." Junior said, "I told you, I told all of you." And the man on his other side said, "Shut up, Junior," but laughing while he said it, actually laughing. And that small sound opened something in the room the way a window opens a space that's been closed too long. Maggie went back and forth to the kitchen 3 times, refilling the central pot. She brought out the cobbler, and a man whose name she didn't know yet made a sound that was frankly embarrassing and completely genuine, and the 2 men next to him leaned over to look at it, like it was something rare. Cole had not touched his plate. She came out with the last of the cornbread and stopped at his end of the table and said quietly, just for him, "Something wrong?" He looked at the bowl, looked at her. His jaw worked once, the way a man's jaw works when he's doing something with his face that he doesn't normally do, keeping something in rather than letting it out. Then he picked up his spoon and ate. She went back to the kitchen. She was at the sink, soap to her elbows, when she heard it happen. Not one thing, just everything at once. The natural volume of men who've stopped being careful with themselves, rising through the wall like warmth. Junior explaining something wrong and confidently. 2 men arguing about fence line. Cal saying something that made the whole table laugh. Real laugh, not the polite kind. Maggie stood at the sink and listened, and pressed her hands flat against the bottom of the basin, and breathed. "Ruth, I'm here. I'm doing it." "Miss Holden!" Cole stood in the kitchen doorway. He had a way of arriving without sound, which she suspected came from years of work that required it. He looked at her with those dark, careful eyes, and she had the same feeling she'd had earlier, that he was seeing more than she intended to show. "Men want to know if supper's going to be like this from now on," he said. "That or better, depending on what we have to work with. We're low on most things. I'm taking the wagon to Rollins Saturday. I'll have your list by Thursday night." He didn't move to leave. She waited. "She taught you well," he said. "Ruth. She was the best woman I ever knew." Maggie kept her hands in the water. "She raised me after my mother passed. Taught me everything worth knowing in a kitchen, and most of what's worth knowing about people." She paused. "She asked me for 1 week. I'm giving her 1 week." Cole was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. Not softer exactly, but more careful. "She mentioned you in her letters, while she was still here." He looked at the wall above the stove rather than at Maggie. "Said you were carrying something you'd been carrying too long. That you'd gotten so used to the weight, you'd stopped knowing it was there." Maggie's hands went still. "She also said," he continued, same even tone, "that the person she trusted most in the world was her niece in Wyoming, who was lying about her husband being dead." He looked at her then, direct and without cruelty. "She didn't tell me why. Said it wasn't her story." The fire popped in the stove. Outside, the wind moved across the porch. Maggie pulled her hands from the water and dried them slowly. When she spoke, it was the same way she'd pulled out that knife. Not planned, just necessary. "My husband is alive," she said. "He left 2 years ago for a woman in Denver. I told everyone he died, because a dead husband gets you sympathy, and a husband who left you makes people wonder what you did wrong." She met his eyes. "I'm not proud of it, but I did it to survive, and I'd probably do it again." Cole nodded once. The way he'd nodded earlier, when she'd explained herself about the knife. Not approval, not judgment, just receipt. Received. Filed. Not to be raised again unless she chose. "The name you're using," he said. "Holden. My mother's name." "Good name." She almost laughed. It came out as a breath instead. "You're not going to tell me I should have stayed and fought for the marriage? Or gone after him? Or forgiven him for my own sake?" She'd heard all three, in various forms, from various well-meaning people in the 2 years since. "Wasn't my marriage," Cole said. "Wasn't my choice to make." She looked at him. He was already looking away, back at that middle distance he seemed to prefer, some point slightly beyond the room that she suspected held something he returned to often. Something he turned over, the way a man turns over a stone he knows is there, but still checks every time. She'd noticed it 3 times now. The way a sound from outside made him go still for just a half-second too long. The way he'd looked at Junior earlier, not unkind, but with a flicker of something that came and went fast, like a man who sees a face he recognizes in a crowd and then wishes he hadn't. Whatever he was carrying, it was specific. It had a shape. It wasn't just grief in the general way of men who'd lived hard lives. It was a particular thing, a particular moment, and it lived in him like a splinter that had gone too deep to find. She didn't ask. It wasn't time. "Get your list together," he said, pushing off the doorframe. "And, Miss Holden." She looked up. "Whatever it is you're running from." He put on his hat. "Ruth was right. You've been running so long you forgot to notice you were doing it." He held her gaze 1 beat. "While you're on this ranch, just cook. That's all you have to do." He walked out. Maggie stood in the kitchen that had been her aunt's for 3 years and listened to his boots fade across the frozen ground until there was nothing but the fire and the distant sound of men who'd just eaten a real meal for the first time in 6 weeks. She took Ruth's letter from her apron pocket, read the last line again. "Stop running, Maggie. Find a place that needs you, and let it need you back. That's what home is. That's all it ever was." She folded the letter. Through the wall, someone had found a harmonica. A rough, easy tune. Nothing fancy. Just a man playing because he felt like it. Which was the sound of a man who had something in him that needed out. Cal laughed at something Junior said. Hector's voice, low and steady, corrected somebody about something. Outside, the Wyoming dark pressed cold and total against the windows. Maggie put the letter in her pocket, pulled out a clean sheet of paper, and started writing the supply list. She had beans enough for 2 more days if she stretched them. No sugar. Low on salt. The cobbler had used the last of the dried apples. There was coffee for 3 days, maybe 4 if she was careful, and she intended to be careful about the coffee above all things. She wrote until her hand cramped. She crossed things out and rewrote them. She calculated quantities the way her father had taught her to calculate numbers. Not what you had, but what you needed, and then what you'd need after that. Because the men who failed were always the ones who only planned 1 step ahead. She was almost done when she heard it. A sound from outside. Not the wind, not an animal. A single boot on the far side of the porch, deliberate and slow. The way a person steps when they don't want to be heard. Then, nothing. Maggie sat very still, pencil in hand. Then nothing again. Just the wind. Just the dark. She looked at the kitchen window, black as ink. Her own face reflected faintly back at her. And for just 1 second, she had the cold, certain feeling of being watched by something that had been watching for longer than tonight. She put the pencil down, picked it back up, kept writing. 1 week, she told herself. 6 more days. Cook the meals, honor the debt, walk away clean. The harmonica played on through the wall, low and easy. And somewhere out there in the Wyoming dark, Cole Hargrove walked back to whatever silence he'd built for himself, carrying whatever weight had no name. And the feeling on the porch, the boot, the watching, settled into the back of Maggie's mind like a stone dropped in deep water. She felt it hit the bottom. She just didn't yet know what was waiting down there. The boot sound on the porch was still in her head when Maggie woke at 4 the next morning. She lay still for a moment in the small room off the kitchen that had been Ruth's. The same narrow bed, the same hook on the wall, the same draft coming through the same gap in the same window frame that Ruth had apparently never gotten around to fixing. And she listened to the ranch breathe around her. Cattle in the distance, wind in the eaves. The particular quality of silence that belongs to places that are awake before the people in them. Nothing on the porch, just the dark. She got up anyway. By the time the first gray light came through the kitchen window, she had coffee on, biscuits in the oven, salt pork sliced and waiting for the pan, and a pot of something she was calling porridge, because calling it what it actually was, cornmeal stretched with hot water and the last of a small jar of sorghum she'd found behind a rusted tin of saddle oil, would not have sold it effectively to 16 men who'd been hoping for something better. Junior arrived first, the way she'd already begun to suspect he always did, with his hair uncombed and his boots unlaced, and an expression of pure, desperate hope. "Biscuits?" he said. "Don't touch them. I can smell them from the bunkhouse. I want you to know that. I was lying there, and I could actually smell them." Junior. "Ma'am?" "Lace your boots." He looked down, looked back up. "After biscuits?" "Before." He sat down on the floor right there in the kitchen doorway and laced his boots with the focused energy of a person completing a task entirely to get it out of the way. And Maggie turned back to the stove and allowed herself, briefly, to find this funny. The boy reminded her of something she hadn't let herself think about in 2 years. She put it back where it came from and kept cooking. The men came in waves, the early risers who moved through the world like they were apologizing for taking up space, quiet and efficient. Then the middle group, louder, still carrying sleep in their faces. Then the stragglers, and with them, Boyd Denton, who came in last and stood in the doorway looking at the table the way he'd looked at her kitchen the night before. Not hostile exactly, just assessing, checking whether anything had changed in a way that would require him to update his position. Everything had changed. That was the problem, from Boyd Denton's perspective. He sat. He ate. He said nothing, which, from a man who'd picked up her wooden spoon and stirred her pot the night before, Maggie counted as something approaching cooperation. Hector came in, poured his own coffee without asking, sat at the far end of the table, and read a folded piece of paper that looked like a work order. He did not look at the food. He did not comment on the food. After 10 minutes, he finished his plate, folded the paper back into his pocket, and said to no one in particular, "Fence line on the north pasture needs 2 men today. Denton, Cal." Denton looked up. "We doing the fence today?" "We're doing the fence today." "Ground's still half frozen from Sunday." "Then you'll work harder." Hector stood, carried his own plate to the kitchen, set it in the basin, and walked out. This, Maggie would come to understand, was his highest form of compliment. He did not leave plates on the table for other people to deal with when the meal had been worth eating. Cole came in when half the men had already gone back out. He poured coffee, sat at the head of the table with what was left of the biscuits and the porridge she'd kept warm on the back burner, and ate without speaking. Maggie came out to collect plates, and he looked up. "Supply list," he said. "On the counter. I finished it last night." He nodded, drank his coffee, looked at the window. The morning light was coming in clean and cold, and it caught the side of his face in a way that showed the scar under his jaw, small and white and old. Maggie had noticed it the day before and filed it away the same way she'd filed away everything else about Cole Hargrove. The middle distance he preferred, the way he went still at sounds, the weight he carried that had a specific shape she hadn't yet identified. "Something on the porch last night," she said. Cole's cup stopped halfway to his mouth, just for a half second. "What kind of something?" "A boot. 1 step, then nothing. Maybe 10 o'clock. He set the cup down. "You sure it wasn't one of the men?" "Men headed to the bunkhouse go around the south side. Whoever it was came up the north end, near the kitchen window, and stopped." She met his eyes. "Then left." Cole was quiet. He had a way of being quiet that was different from other people's quiet. It wasn't absence. It was the thing you felt when a room got very still right before weather came. He was thinking something he wasn't ready to say yet. "I'll look at the ground this morning," he said finally. "Frost might have held a print." "I already looked." She picked up his empty plate. "Partial boot print, large, right side of the north porch post. Whoever it was stood there long enough to leave a depression and then walk back toward the tree line." She paused. "Not one of your men. Boots too new. Ranch hands don't wear new boots." Cole looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't read. Not surprise exactly. Something more like recalibration. Like a man who'd been carrying an assumption and was now quietly setting it aside and picking up a different one. "I'll handle it," he said. "I'm sure you will." She went back to the kitchen. "I'm just telling you what I saw." She heard him stand, heard him take his hat from the rack by the door. Then he stopped, and she heard the quality of the silence change, and she turned around. He was looking at the counter where she'd put the supply list. 3 pages, careful columns, quantities and estimated costs, just like the night before. Because Maggie's father had been an accountant before drinking made him useless. And he'd at least managed to pass on numbers before he went. Cole had picked up the pages and was reading them, with a look on his face that wasn't quite what she'd expected. "This is detailed," he said. "That's my job." Ruth's lists were half a page, sometimes less. Ruth was working with an established pantry and regular supply runs. I'm working from near empty, and I need to know what we're spending and where we're spending it, so I can tell you where we're wasting money. She dried her hands. Third page has a cost comparison. The supplier you're using in Rollins is overcharging you by about 30% on cornmeal and salt pork. There's a merchant in Casper who advertises better rates. Longer ride, but worth it if you're making a big purchase. Cole looked at the third page. "I circled it," she said. He looked at the circled entry. He looked up at her. He did not say anything for a long moment, and in that moment, Maggie felt the particular discomfort of having done something competent in front of a man who hadn't expected it and wasn't sure yet how to hold that. "I'll look into it," he said. "You should." She turned back to the sink. "You're bleeding money on basics, and that's money you could be spending on cattle or repairs or a dozen other things that matter more than overpriced cornmeal." He left. Junior appeared in the kitchen doorway 30 seconds later, with the expression of a person who had been listening around a corner and was not sufficiently ashamed of this. "You know he didn't thank you," he said. "He doesn't have to thank me. Most people say thank you when someone saves them money." "Most people aren't Cole Hargrove." She handed him a stack of plates. "Put these away. Top cabinet on the left." Junior put them away, then stayed, which she was beginning to accept as simply what Junior did. He was like a stray cat, who'd decided she was his person, not because she'd been warm to him, but because she'd given him a task and he'd done it, and there was something satisfying to him about that transaction. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You're going to anyway." "What happened to your husband?" She didn't slow down. "He died." Junior was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry." "Thank you, Junior." A longer pause. "The way you said that," he started, then stopped. "What about it?" "Nothing." He shuffled his feet. "My mama used to make that same face when she talked about my daddy leaving. Like it was a sore tooth she'd gotten used to, but it still hurt when she moved wrong." He looked at the window. "I'm not trying to be rude, ma'am. I just noticed things." Maggie set down the pot she was holding and looked at him. He was 19, which meant he was old enough to see things and young enough to say them out loud without understanding why most people stopped doing that somewhere along the way. "Your mother," she said. "She still living?" "No, ma'am. Fever, 3 years back. Then my daddy. Then last month my pa." He said it without drama, the way people say hard things they've said enough times that they found the right flat tone for them. "It's just me now. That's why I came to Copper Ridge. Hector knew my pa, gave me a job." He straightened up. "I know I talk too much. Mr. Hargrove tells me about once a day." "You talk exactly the right amount," Maggie said. "The world needs people who say things out loud. They just also need to know when to stop." She picked up the pot again. "This is one of those times." He grinned. "Yes, ma'am." By midday she had dinner planned and lunch on the table and was 2 hours into what she'd decided was a complete reorganization of the pantry system when Hector came in from the north pasture with mud on his boots and a look on his face that meant something had happened that he hadn't decided yet how to present. He sat down at the kitchen table. She put coffee in front of him without asking. "The print on the porch," he said. She waited. Cole found 2 more. Along the tree line, north side. Came in from the road, stopped at the porch, went back the same way. Hector wrapped both hands around the cup. Someone was watching the house. For how long? The depth of the impressions in the frost, he paused. A while. Maggie leaned against the counter. "Who?" "Don't know yet." Hector drank, set the cup down. There's a land company out of Cheyenne been sending men around to the smaller ranches in this territory for the past 2 years, buying up land ahead of the railroad. Some owners sold, some didn't. His voice was careful and even. Cole didn't. And they're still interested? They don't stop being interested. They just change methods. Hector looked at her directly. I'm telling you this because you're sleeping in the room closest to the kitchen window, and you said yourself you noticed a sound that nobody else noticed. That makes you useful. Useful people should have information. Maggie held his gaze. Is Cole in danger? Cole is always in some kind of danger. He's a man who owns land that other men want, and he refuses to pretend otherwise. Hector picked up his cup again. What I'm asking is whether you're the kind of woman who, if something happened in the night, would do something about it, or would lock her door and wait. She didn't hesitate. I'd do something about it. Hector nodded. Ruth said as much. Ruth knew a lot about me. Ruth knew a lot about everything. He stood. She told me something else, too. She said the reason you moved around so much these past 2 years wasn't just your husband leaving. He met her eyes. She said there was something before that. Something you blamed yourself for that you had no business blaming yourself for. The kitchen went very quiet. Maggie's hands were still on the counter. She kept them still. Ruth loved you, Hector said, not unkindly. She worried about you the way a woman worries about someone she can't reach. He put on his hat. I'm not asking you to tell me anything. I'm asking you to remember that whatever it is, it followed you here, and the people on this ranch have a way of noticing weight that doesn't belong to the land. He walked out. Maggie stood in the kitchen for a long moment without moving. Then she picked up her rag and her inventory list and got back to work. Dinner was bean soup again, stretched further with the last of the carrots from the root cellar, and a marrow bone she'd found tucked in the back of the cold storage behind a crock of old butter. She made it good. She made everything she touched good. Not because she was performing for the men, or for Cole, or even for Ruth's memory, but because making food badly was the one kind of failure she could always prevent, and there was comfort in that. A specific comfort she'd been relying on for years. The men ate. The room was louder than the night before, easier, the way a space gets when people have decided to stop being careful in it. Cal told a story about a horse that ended with the horse winning, which Maggie suspected was the point. Boyd Denton argued with a man named Garrett about the right way to fix a post hole. Junior ate 3 bowls and tried to claim he'd only had 2. Cole ate and said nothing, and watched the room the way he always watched it. Not like a man watching for trouble, but like a man watching for something he'd lost and hadn't yet figured out he was looking for. After dinner, when the men had cleared out and Junior had finished washing the plates under Maggie's instruction and finally gone to the bunkhouse, Cole came into the kitchen. She was wiping down the stove. Hector told you about the prince, he said. He did. He shouldn't have. He thought I should know. She kept working. He was right. Cole leaned against the doorframe. He had his hat in his hands and he was turning it slowly at the brim, a quarter turn one way and then back, which she was beginning to recognize as his version of not knowing what to do with his hands. There's a company called Halloran Land Partners. They've been after this ranch for about 1.5 years, made 3 offers. I turned all 3 down. Hector mentioned the railroad. Railroad's coming through northern Wyoming in the next 5 years. Whoever owns the land on the ridge has the best access to the pass. He looked at the hat in his hands. My grandfather chose this land because of that ridge. He didn't know about any railroad. He just knew it was the best ground he'd ever seen. Something crossed his face. I'm not selling it. I didn't ask you to. I know. He looked up. But I want you to understand why someone might be watching the house. It's not random. It's not some drifter. He paused. And since Ruth asked you here, and you're sleeping 20 feet from the kitchen window. You deserve to know what you're in the middle of." Maggie set down the rag. She turned and looked at him fully, the way she'd been looking at him since she arrived. Directly, without softening it. The way she looked at everything she needed to understand. "I've been in the middle of things before," she said. "Mining camp disputes, Army supply line arguments, a logging operation in Oregon that turned into a full brawl over land rights." She crossed her arms. "I'm still standing." The corner of Cole's mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The shadow of the possibility of one, which, from what she'd seen of Cole Hargrove, was probably as close as he got. "Ruth said you were hard to rattle," he said. "Ruth was being kind. I'm impossible to rattle." She picked up the rag again. "What are you going to do about the man in the tree line?" The not-quite smile disappeared. "Watch for him. Find out who he is. Decide from there." "And in the meantime?" "In the meantime, you cook and I run the ranch, and we don't give Halloran Partners anything to report back that makes this place look like it's struggling." He put his hat on. "Which means those 3 pages you gave me this morning were more useful than you know." She raised an eyebrow. "A ranch that knows its own numbers," he said, "is harder to push around than one that doesn't. Halloran's been assuming we're operating blind." He paused at the door. "We're not. Not anymore." He left, and Maggie listened to his boots on the porch steps, and then on the frozen ground, and then nothing. She stood in Ruth's kitchen with the rag in her hand and the fire ticking down in the stove, and thought about land and railroad lines and men who stood in tree lines at night watching windows. She thought about the way Cole had said, "Not anymore." She thought about Ruth's letter. "Find a place that needs you and let it need you back." She wrung out the rag, hung it over the rack, and checked the locks on the kitchen window. Both latched. She pulled the curtain across. Then she went to her room, sat on Ruth's narrow bed, and in the dark listened to the ranch settle around her. The cattle, the wind, the distant sound of someone in the bunkhouse who couldn't sleep, which sounded like Junior because it was accompanied by the faint, aimless plucking of something that might eventually become a tune. She was still listening when she heard it again. Not on the porch this time. Further away, out past the garden, near the well. A sound that could have been an animal and wasn't. A single, deliberate sound, and then the unmistakable silence of something that had decided to be very still. Maggie sat in the dark. She did not move for a long time. Whatever was out there, it was patient. She could be patient too. She'd learned patience in places that would have broken a person who didn't understand that waiting was its own form of action, that staying still when every instinct said move was sometimes the most powerful thing you could do. But patience, she knew from hard experience, only worked if you had something worth waiting for on the other side of it. She was starting, against everything she'd promised herself, to think she might. The sound near the well didn't come back that night, but Maggie didn't sleep much anyway. She was up at 4 again, fire going, coffee measured, and when Junior arrived at his usual time with his boots unlaced and his hair uncombed, she handed him a bucket and sent him to the well before he could say a word about biscuits. He went without argument, which told her the mood of the morning before anyone else arrived to confirm it. He came back in 3 minutes instead of 10. "Ma'am?" His voice was different, the cheerful looseness gone out of it. She turned from the stove. "Someone cut the rope on the well," he said. "Clean through. Bucket's gone down and there's no way to get it back up without a new rope and a hook." He held the severed end out to her. The cut was straight, deliberate, made with something sharp. Not fraying, not wear. I looked around. Didn't see anybody. But the ground near the post is all pressed down, like someone stood there a while. Maggie looked at the rope. Then she looked at Junior's face, which was trying very hard to be older than 19, and not quite managing it. "Put that on the counter," she said. "Don't say anything to the men yet. Go get Hector. Not Mr. Hargrove? Hector first. Junior put the rope on the counter and went. Maggie stood at the stove and kept cooking because the men would be up in an hour, and they would eat whether the well rope was cut or not. And a kitchen that stopped producing food in a crisis was a kitchen that had already lost. She'd learned that in a mining camp in Colorado, when a shaft collapse had taken 4 men, and the camp boss had told everyone to go back to their tents, and she'd instead built the fire higher and cooked everything she had. Because grief needed something to do with its hands, and so did she. Hector came in, looked at the rope, looked at Maggie, and said nothing for a long moment. "They're escalating," he said. "That's what I thought." Cutting a well rope is a message. It's not serious damage. We've got the creek for water, and a replacement rope in the equipment shed. But it's meant to say we can get to you. We can reach into your property and touch things. He picked up the rope, examined the cut, set it back down. They want Cole rattled. They want him making decisions from fear instead of from sense. Then we don't tell Cole yet. Hector looked at her. "We fix the rope before he comes in for breakfast," she said. "We don't make it a crisis. We handle it, we note it, and we tell him after breakfast when he's eaten and the men are out and he can think straight." She turned back to the stove. A man who finds out his well was tampered with before his first coffee makes a different decision than a man who finds out after. Hector was quiet for a moment. "Ruth said you were good at managing situations." "Ruth was my aunt, not my press agent." She said it like a fact, not a compliment. He picked up the rope. "I'll have Junior get the replacement from the shed. We'll have it fixed before the men are up." He paused at the door. "You're going to have to tell him, Maggie, not just about the rope, about what you heard by the well last night." "I know. He needs the full picture." "I said I know, Hector." He left. She heard him speaking to Junior outside in a low, quick voice, and then the sound of boots moving fast across the frozen ground toward the equipment shed. She turned the salt pork in the pan and watched the fat render and thought about men who cut ropes in the dark and what they were willing to do next. Cole came in at the same time he always came in, after most of the men had eaten and the room had thinned out. He poured his coffee, sat at the head of the table, and Maggie came out from the kitchen and sat down across from him, which she had not done before. He looked at her over his cup. "Something happened." "Well, rope was cut last night. Junior found it this morning. Hector had it fixed before breakfast." She put the piece of severed rope on the table between them. "And I heard someone near the well around midnight." That was the second sound. Not the porch. The well. Cole looked at the rope for a long time without touching it. His jaw was set in the way she'd learned meant he was controlling something that wanted out. "Clean cut," he said. "Sharp knife. Someone who knew what they were doing and wasn't in a hurry." She met his eyes. They stood there long enough that the ground was pressed down. Junior noticed it. Junior. Something moved across Cole's face at the mention of the boy. That same flicker she'd seen before, fast and specific. There and gone. He didn't say anything at breakfast. "I asked him not to. I didn't want the men wound up before a workday." She paused. "Was that the wrong call?" Cole picked up the rope. "No." He set it down. "It was the right call." He was quiet again, turning the cut end in his fingers. 3 months ago, they sent a man to make a 4th offer on the ranch. I turned him away at the gate. 2 weeks after that, 2 of my calves went missing from the south pasture. Might have been weather. Might have been coyotes. He looked up. Might not have been. "You should have a dog." "I had one. She died in July." A pause that held more weight than it should have, and then he moved past it. Halloran doesn't play rough as a first move. They pressure, they wear down, they wait for a man to get tired and make a bad decision. Cutting the rope is them telling me they've moved past waiting. He stood, picked up his hat. I need to make some arrangements. What kind of arrangements? The kind where I write a letter to my lawyer in Cheyenne and another one to the county sheriff, and I make sure that every piece of paper connected to this property is in order and accounted for. He looked at her. Because if Halloran decides to move from rope cutting to something else, I want every legal protection I can get in place before they do. He turned to leave, then stopped. It was the same stop as the night before, and the night before that. That particular pause at the threshold that she'd come to understand was the moment Cole Hargrove decided whether to say the thing he'd been not saying or keep it to himself. Most of the time he kept it to himself. She was learning to wait without showing that she was waiting. "There's a woman," he said, not turning around. "In town. Della Marsh. She'll come out here this week, probably. She comes every few weeks with her boy." He was looking at the doorframe. "She's a good woman. Lost her husband 2 years back. There's been an understanding between her and the men. Between her and me." He stopped. "I want you to know before she gets here, in case anyone says anything that sounds like more than it is." Maggie kept her face exactly where she'd put it. "That's your business, Mr. Hargrove." "Cole." "That's your business, Cole." He looked at her then, and she held his gaze with the same steadiness she'd held everything else. And whatever he was reading in her face, he apparently found sufficient, because he nodded once and left. Maggie sat at the table for a moment after she heard his boots on the porch. She looked at the severed rope. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, and noted that there was a weight in her chest that had not been there before he mentioned Della Marsh. And she noted it the way she noted inconvenient truths, clearly, without flinching, and with the firm intention of doing something productive about it, instead of letting it sit there and become a problem. She picked up the rope, took it back to the kitchen, and started on lunch. Della Marsh arrived Thursday. Maggie heard the wagon before she saw it, a light rig coming up the main road with a good horse and a driver who knew how to handle one. She was in the garden plot behind the cookhouse when it pulled into the yard, turning over the frozen topsoil with a spade she'd found in the equipment shed, because Hector had told her the ground needed to be broken before the real cold set in, if she wanted anything to grow in the spring. And she'd decided that thinking about spring was the kind of thing a person did when they'd decided to stay. She stuck the spade into the ground and looked. Della Marsh was 28, which Maggie felt before she calculated it. There was something about youth that the body registered before the mind did, a kind of ease in the movement that hadn't yet learned to be careful. She was pretty, in the straightforward way of women who didn't try very hard at it. Dark-haired, with a capable look about her, and a boy of about 6 on the seat beside her, who was already twisting to look at everything at once. Cole came out of the barn. Maggie picked up her spade and went back to work. She didn't watch what happened next. She listened to it without meaning to. Della's voice, warm and familiar. The boy's higher pitch asking something about the horses. Cole's low one-word answers. Then footsteps crossing to the house. Then nothing. Junior appeared at her elbow, with the unerring instinct of someone who always showed up when something interesting was happening. "That's Mrs. Marsh," he said. I gathered. "She's been coming out here since about May. Her boy Daniel likes the horses." He picked up a clod of frozen dirt and turned it in his hands. "She's nice, real nice. The men like her. She brought a pie once." A pause. "Apple. It was good." Junior. "I'm just saying, she brings food sometimes." He looked at Maggie sideways, with the careful expression of a person who thinks they're being subtle and isn't. "Not as good as yours, though. Not even close." "Go mend something." I mended everything this morning. Hector said I was the most thorough mender he'd seen, and to go find Miss Holden and see what she needed. Maggie doubted that was an exact quote, but let it go. Then go get water from the creek. I need 2 full buckets for tonight's pot. He went. She kept turning soil until she heard the house door open again, and then she heard Cole say, "She's in the garden, probably," and then footsteps coming her way, and she pushed the spade in clean and turned to face it. Della Marsh stopped a few feet away and looked at Maggie with an expression that was doing a great deal of work very quickly. Assessing, recalibrating, presenting itself as warm, while something careful moved underneath it. Maggie recognized the expression because she'd worn it herself. "You must be Miss Holden," Della said. "I'm Della Marsh. I'm in town most weeks. Cole said you'd arrived to cook for the ranch." "That's right." Maggie pulled off her work glove and offered her hand. "Maggie, my Aunt Ruth worked the kitchen here until she passed." Ruth was wonderful. Della shook her hand, and her grip was firm, which Maggie respected. "The whole town loved Ruth. I was so sorry when she got sick." She looked at the turned soil. "Are you planting?" "Breaking the ground for spring. Won't be able to put anything in until March, but if I don't start the ground now, there's nothing to put in by then." Della looked at the plot, then at Maggie, and the thing moving underneath her expression shifted slightly. Something like recognition, the kind one woman has for another when she understands that the person in front of her is more permanently situated than she'd assumed. "Cole mentioned you'd be staying a week," she said, and her voice was careful. "That was the original arrangement." Maggie met her eyes. "Things have a way of developing." The silence between them was the kind that carried a great deal of information without either of them saying it. Della Marsh was not a villain. Maggie knew that with the same clarity she knew weather coming. This was a woman looking for a safe harbor for herself and her boy, and she'd identified Cole Hargrove as possibly that harbor. And Maggie's presence was a variable she hadn't accounted for. That didn't make her bad. It made her a person doing what people did when they were trying to survive. "He's a good man," Della said finally, quietly. "He appears to be," Maggie said. Another pause. "Daniel loves it out here," Della said, and her voice had let go of the careful thing and was just honest now. "He's 6, and he's never had a father, and Cole lets him follow him around the barn for an hour when we come out. Doesn't make a fuss about it, just lets the boy watch and ask questions." She looked at her own hands. "That's not nothing. For a boy without a father, that's not nothing at all." Maggie looked at her. She felt something in her chest move, something she hadn't expected to feel, something that had no business being tender toward a woman who was a complication in a situation that was already complicated enough. "No," she said, "it's not nothing." Della left 2 hours later, with Daniel asleep on the wagon seat and a jar of Maggie's preserved apples that Maggie had pressed on her without quite knowing why. And after the wagon disappeared down the road, Cole came and stood in the garden, in the way he stood everywhere, occupying space without quite committing to it. "She'll understand," he said. Maggie turned over a section of earth. "There's nothing to understand." "Maggie." She stopped. He almost never used her name without the miss in front of it. "I wasn't leading her to believe anything that was real," he said. "That was wrong of me. I knew it was wrong, and I let it continue, because it was easier than being honest about the fact that I wasn't, that I'm not." He stopped. "That, whatever I was doing, it wasn't fair to her." Maggie set down the spade. She turned and looked at him, and he was looking at the ground between them, the way men look at things they'd rather not look at directly. "She deserves someone who's actually present," he said. "I wasn't present." "Where were you?" He looked up. His eyes had the dark, flat quality they got when he was close to something he didn't usually approach. 8 years ago, before I bought this ranch, I was working federal investigation out of Cheyenne. He said it simply, like reading from a document. There was a case. A man who'd been robbing homesteads up and down the territory, moving fast, hard to track. I had a name. I had enough to know who it was. He stopped. I needed 2 more days of evidence to make the arrest stick in court. Solid case. Nothing thrown out on procedure. Maggie waited. He hit another homestead in those 2 days. Family of 4. The father and mother were away in town. Cole's jaw worked once. There was a boy, 8 years old. Name was Henry Pruitt. He looked at a point past her shoulder. I had the name 2 days before Henry Pruitt died. I made a choice, and a child paid for it. The garden was very quiet. I got the conviction, Cole said. Case held up perfectly. Judge said it was the cleanest case he'd seen in a decade. His voice was without any particular emotion, the voice of a man who'd said these words to himself so many times that he'd sanded all the feeling out of them, and what was left was just the shape of the thing. I left the service 6 months later, used everything I'd saved to buy this ranch, put as much distance between myself and that choice as the territory allowed. He finally looked at her. That's what I'm carrying, if that's what you're asking. I wasn't asking. No, but you've been wondering since you got here, and I'd rather tell you than have you keep working it out on your own. Maggie picked up her spade. She didn't say anything for a long moment, long enough that she felt Cole shift his weight, and she understood that he was waiting for judgment, the way a person waits who's been waiting for years and has made a kind of peace with it, but not really. A boy died, she said. That's true. That was real, and it was terrible, and it will always have happened. She turned the spade in her hands. And you made a decision based on what you knew at the time, with the tools and the authority and the information you had, and it turned out to be the wrong decision. And you've been treating that as a debt you have to keep paying until there's nothing left of you. She looked at him. That's also true. That's a generous reading. That's an accurate reading. She drove the spade into the ground. I know something about carrying guilt that belongs to a situation you couldn't control, Cole. I know what it looks like when a person makes it their whole identity, because it's easier than accepting that some things are just terrible and nobody's fault entirely, and life kept going anyway. She met his eyes. Guilt that size doesn't make you more responsible. It just makes you less useful. He looked at her for a long moment, with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the closed, careful face. Something underneath it. Something that had been pressed down under the weight of 8 years and was pressing back. Your aunt, he said slowly. She lost someone too. Maggie's hands tightened on the spade. Yes. She told me once. Not who, not what. Just that she understood carrying something that didn't have a good place to put it down. He paused. Is that what she saw in you, when she sent you here? The evening was coming in cold and fast, the light going thin and gray across the frozen ground, and in the distance she could hear Junior and Cal arguing about something near the barn, in the easy, unserious way of people who had nowhere else to be. My daughter, Maggie said. The word came out smaller than she intended. She was 3. Fever, same as my mother. Same as every woman in the Carey line who ever died too young. I was working at a camp in Nevada, and I'd sent her to stay with Ruth for the summer because the camp was no place for a child, and I thought... She stopped. I thought I was being sensible. I thought I was making the right choice. Ruth had her for 6 weeks, and then the fever came, and it was 4 days, and she was gone, and I wasn't there. Her voice was flat, the way Cole's had been flat, the sanded-down version. I wasn't there when she died, because I'd made what I thought was the sensible choice. Cole didn't say anything. He didn't try to offer her the words people offered, the ones that meant well and landed wrong. He just stood in the garden in the cold evening and let the silence be what it was. And that, Maggie thought, that right there, that was the most honest thing anyone had given her in 2 years. "I'm sorry," he said finally. Just those 2 words, and they were enough, because they weren't trying to fix anything. "So am I." She picked up her glove. "For you, for Henry Pruitt, for all of it." They stood in the near dark, 2 people who had each made a choice at the wrong moment and spent years afterward trying to figure out what they owed. And the wind came down off the ridge, cold and clean and carrying the first real bite of winter. And Maggie felt something shift in her chest. Something that had been locked at a particular angle for 2 years, that was no longer locked at exactly that angle. It wasn't relief. It was something quieter than relief. The particular stillness of a weight that hasn't been put down yet, but has been acknowledged, which was its own kind of progress. "We should go in," she said. "Yeah." Neither of them moved for another moment. Then from the barn came a crash, and Junior's voice rising in immediate loud defense of whatever he'd just knocked over, and Cal's voice responding with the particular exhaustion of a man who had accepted that working alongside Junior meant accepting a certain rate of accidents. And Cole made the sound she'd decided was his version of a laugh, a single exhale through the nose, barely there. And they walked back toward the house together in the cold, not touching, not speaking, just moving in the same direction, which was, Maggie thought, how most true things started. She had the kitchen door in her hand when Hector came fast around the corner of the house from the north side, and his face had a look she hadn't seen on it before. The careful steadiness gone. Something sharp and alert in its place. "We've got a problem," he said. Cole stopped. "What kind?" "The kind that just rode in off the Cheyenne Road." Hector looked from Cole to Maggie and back. "2 men. They're not ranch hands, and they're not from town. One of them's asking for the owner, and the other one's sitting his horse like he's been paid to be there and intends to collect." Cole's face had gone back to the closed, careful version. The underneath of it was gone, pressed back down, the lock back in place. "Where are they?" "Main gate. I told them to wait." Cole looked at Maggie. Something passed between them, too quick and too complicated for words. The compressed communication of 2 people who had just told each other the hardest things they knew, and were now being asked to set it all aside and deal with what was in front of them. "Stay in the kitchen," he said. "That's not going to happen, Maggie. I can read a contract faster than any man on this property, and you know it." She let go of the door. "If they've brought papers, you want me there." Cole looked at her for one beat. Then he looked at Hector. Hector said nothing, which was its own answer. "Fine," Cole said. "But you let me speak first." "Gladly," Maggie said, and she meant it, because there were times for speaking first, and times for watching carefully. And this was the second kind, and she'd learned the difference the hard way in a logging camp in Oregon, when a man with papers in a confident manner had walked away with timber rights that should have gone to the workers, and she'd been standing right there, and hadn't known what she was looking at, until it was too late. She was not going to be standing right there again. The 2 men at the gate were waiting with the patience of people who had been trained to be patient in exactly this way. Not relaxed, not hostile, just still in the manner of a threat that hasn't yet decided to become one. The taller one had a leather satchel over his shoulder. The other one had his hands loose near his sides in a way that Maggie had seen in army men who weren't soldiers anymore, but hadn't quite stopped being ready. Cole stopped 10 feet from the gate. "Copper Ridge Ranch?" the tall one said. "You're standing at the gate," Cole said. "What do you want?" The man reached into the satchel. Maggie watched his hands. She watched the other one's hands. She watched the way Cole had put himself slightly in front of her without appearing to do it deliberately. "My name is Aldous Vick," the tall man said. "I represent Halloran Land Partners out of Cheyenne." He held out a folded document. "Mr. Hargrove, we have a new offer for the purchase of this property, and I've been authorized to tell you that this is the last one we intend to make." "Last offers," Maggie said from behind Cole's shoulder, "are usually just better threats." Vic looked at her. "And you are?" "Someone who reads contracts for breakfast." She held out her hand. "Let me see it." Vic looked at Maggie the way men like him always looked at women who asked for documents. Like she was a weather event he hadn't prepared for, and wasn't sure yet how to categorize. Then he looked at Cole, who said nothing, and moved nothing, except to give the smallest nod that could still be called a nod. And Vic handed the document to Maggie. She unfolded it and read. She read the way her father had taught her to read contracts. Not fast, not slow, but with the particular quality of attention that treated every word as a potential trap, and every blank space as intentional. The cold was working at her hands, and she didn't let it matter. Vic stood with his satchel and his carefully patient face. The other man sat his horse and watched the middle distance. Cole stood slightly in front of her and said nothing, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. She got to the third page. She read the third page twice. Then she folded the document along its original creases and held it at her side and looked at Aldous Vick. "This isn't a purchase offer," she said. Vick's patient face adjusted almost imperceptibly. "It's a lease agreement with a purchase option attached. The lease terms give Halloran Partners operational control of the North Ridge for 30 years. The purchase option is priced at current market value, not future value, which means that when the railroad comes through and this land is worth 4 times what it is today, Halloran buys it at today's price." She held the document out to Cole without looking away from Vic. "They're not trying to buy the ranch. They're trying to get control of the ridge before the railroad arrives, so they can buy it cheap after it does." Cole took the document. He didn't open it. Vic's patient face was working harder now. "Miss Holden, and I'd think carefully about what you say next, Mr. Vick, because I have a very good memory, and a letter that's going to the Wyoming Territory Banking Commission next week that already has your employer's name on it. And how much additional content ends up in that letter depends considerably on this conversation." The second man's hands had stopped being quite so loose near his sides. Cole noticed this. Maggie noticed that Cole noticed it, and she noticed that Cole's weight had shifted in the particular way of a man who had decided to be ready without deciding what to be ready for. "The offer expires in 48 hours, Vic said. His voice had lost the patient quality entirely. What was underneath it was harder. "Mr. Hargrove, I'd encourage you to consult with your—" He glanced at Maggie. "With your people, and give this proper consideration. Halloran is prepared to be generous on the lease terms." "Halloran has already been generous enough with our well rope," Maggie said. Something moved across Vic's face. Fast, gone, but there. Cole saw it too. She felt him go very still beside her, in the particular way she'd come to recognize as dangerous stillness. The stillness of a man who had spent years reading people, and had just read something he didn't like. 48 hours, Vic said, and turned his horse. The second man followed without having said a single word, which bothered Maggie more than if he'd spoken. Quiet men on hired horses were a specific kind of problem that loud men rarely were. She and Cole stood at the gate until the sound of hooves faded down the Cheyenne road. Then Cole unfolded the document and read the third page. Maggie watched his face as he read it and saw the moment he found what she'd found. A tightening at the jaw, a flatness in the eyes that was different from his usual flatness. 30 years, he said. 30 years of them on your ridge. And by the time the option to buy comes up, you'd have no legal standing to contest the price, because you'd have already signed the lease agreeing to current market valuation. She took the document back. Your grandfather built this ranch on that ridge, Cole. If they get the lease, they have the ridge. And if they have the ridge when the railroad comes through, everything else on this property is worth considerably less. Cole looked down the empty road. His jaw was working. The thing on Vic's face, he said, when you mentioned the well rope. He knew what it was. He didn't tell whoever sent him to do it to be more careful, but he knew. That puts Halloran directly behind the tampering. It does. And if your lawyer in Cheyenne is worth his fee, that matters. She folded the document and held it out. Keep this. Every piece of paper they've given you is evidence of what they want. Evidence of what they want tells you something about what they're afraid of. Cole took the document and looked at her. The underneath of his face was back, the thing that came through when he'd stopped maintaining the closed, careful version. What are they afraid of? That you'll wait them out. That the railroad timeline will shift, and they'll have spent years pressuring a man who wouldn't sell and end up with nothing to show for it. She met his eyes. Patient men with good land are the thing land companies fear most. They need you to act from fear. The moment you stop acting from fear, they lose most of their leverage. Cole was quiet for a long moment. You should have been a lawyer, he said. I should have been a lot of things. She turned back toward the house. I'm a cook. Come inside. You need to write that letter to Cheyenne tonight. Hector was waiting on the porch with his arms folded and his face reading the situation off their body language before either of them spoke. He looked at the document in Cole's hand. Then he looked at Maggie. Lease, he said. Lease, she confirmed, with a purchase option priced to steal. Hector unfolded his arms. I'll get Junior. Cole looked up. Junior? Junior's father taught him his letters and his numbers before the drinking got bad. The boy can copy a document without errors, and he's fast. Hector was already moving. You want copies of that to send to your lawyer and the sheriff and anyone else who ought to have one? You want them tonight, before those men report back to whoever sent them. He paused at the door. And I'd move the cattle from the north pasture down to the home range before morning. Cole nodded once. Hector went inside. Maggie started toward the kitchen door, and Cole said, Maggie. She stopped. What you just did at that gate. He was looking at the folded document in his hand, not at her. I want you to know I haven't had someone stand beside me like that in a long time. He paused. Not since before I came here. She didn't turn around immediately. She looked at the kitchen door and the warm light coming through the curtain she'd hung, and the steam rising from the pot she'd left on the back burner. And she thought about the specific weight of being seen by someone who was good at looking. You'd have found it yourself, she said. The third page. Maybe. Not as fast. Fast matters with men like Vic. Yes, Cole said. It does. A pause. Thank you. She went inside. The next 2 days moved the way days move, when something is coming and everyone can feel it, but no one will say so out loud. The men worked harder than usual, which Maggie noticed because hard-working men ate differently than regular working men. More, faster, with less conversation and more focus. The way bodies consumed fuel when they knew they might need the reserve. She cooked accordingly. Bigger pots, heavier food, things that would hold through a long afternoon. Cole wrote 3 letters the night of Vic's visit, and Junior copied them twice each without a single error, which surprised everyone except Maggie, who had noticed the careful way Junior organized the plates she asked him to put away, and drawn her own conclusions about the boy's relationship with order and precision. "You could keep books," she told him while he was finishing the last copy, his handwriting neat and slightly cramped in the manner of someone self-taught. Junior looked up. "For the ranch?" "For anyone who needed it. It's a skill." She put coffee in front of him. "Your father taught you well. When he was sober, he was real good at it." Junior looked at the page. "Drunk, he forgot he'd ever known numbers at all. Funny how that works." "It isn't funny. It's one of the saddest things there is." She sat across from him. "But the skill is yours. What he did with himself doesn't change what he gave you when he was still capable of giving." Junior looked at her for a moment, with the expression he wore when he was thinking something he wasn't sure he should say. "Miss Holden." "Maggie." "Maggie." He turned his pen in his fingers. "Are you going to stay? After the week?" She had not answered this question in 2 days, partly because she was still working out the answer, and partly because she'd learned that saying things before they were completely true had a way of making them less likely to become true. "I'm thinking about it," she said. Junior nodded like this was a significant answer. "Good. I think you should." He went back to his copying. "Also, the men would mutiny if you left. I'm not supposed to tell you that, but you should know." "Who said mutiny?" "Boyd Denton, actually. Which is funny, because he was the hardest on you at first." Junior glanced up. "He told Cal last night that you were the best thing that had happened to this ranch since Ruth, and that if Cole let you walk, he was a bigger fool than he looked." Maggie absorbed this. "Don't tell him I told you," Junior said. "I won't. He'd be real embarrassed." "Junior?" "Right." He finished the last line. "Done." The second morning after Vic's visit, Maggie was breaking eggs into the pan when she heard a horse coming in fast off the south road. Not the easy canter of a ranch hand returning from pasture. Hard riding, with purpose, which was a different sound entirely. She turned the flame down and went to the kitchen window. The rider was a woman, older, maybe 60, riding astride in a split skirt the way women rode who decided that riding side saddle was a courtesy they were no longer extending to anyone. She pulled up in the yard, and Cole came out of the barn, and they spoke for about 30 seconds. And then Cole's head came up, and he looked toward the house, and his face had an expression on it she hadn't seen before. He came inside fast. "Who is she?" Maggie asked. "Clara Dunmore. She owns the Anchor Spread 2 miles east." He was already pulling on his coat. "Her son Eli rode out to the north pasture yesterday afternoon and didn't come back. She thought he might have stopped here for the night." He looked at her. He didn't. The name Eli landed somewhere in the back of Maggie's mind, against the memory of 2 men on horseback, and a second man who hadn't said a word and had his hands too loose near his sides. "How old?" she said. 17. She took her apron off. "I'm coming." Cole didn't argue this time. Clara Dunmore was the kind of woman who had cried all her tears on the 2-mile ride over, and arrived with nothing left but forward motion. She sat her horse and told Cole everything in plain sentences. Eli had ridden north to check on their own fence line. She'd expected him back by dark. He hadn't come. She'd waited until first light. She'd come here first because Anchor shared a fence line with Copper Ridge along the Ridge Road. "The Ridge Road," Cole said, and looked at Hector. Hector was already walking to the barn. "I'll take Boyd and Cal," Cole said. "Hector, bring the medical kit," Maggie said. Cole stopped. "If he's been out since yesterday afternoon and it was below 30 last night," she said, and she kept her voice exactly level, because leveled voices were more useful than frightened ones. Then bring the medical kit and 2 blankets and everything in the cold pantry that's hot portable. She was already moving. I'll have it ready in 10 minutes. She had it ready in 8. She was tying the last bundle when Clara Dunmore came into the kitchen, still in her coat, and stood at the table and gripped the back of a chair and didn't say anything. Maggie recognized this. She'd stood in exactly this kind of way, in exactly this kind of kitchen, on the worst night of her life, holding something solid because the floor wasn't reliable anymore. "Sit down," Maggie said. "I can't." "You can for 1 minute. Sit." Clara sat. Maggie put hot coffee in front of her and stood near enough that there was another person in the room, but far enough that it wasn't crowding. Clara wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at the table. "He's 17, and he thinks he's grown," Clara said. "They all do at 17. He's good with horses, good head on him normally. But that ridge road in the dark, if his horse threw a shoe or the ground gave way along the creek bank—" She stopped, pressed her lips together, kept them pressed together until the thing that wanted out had gone back where it came from. "He's all I have left." Maggie sat down across from her. She'd told herself she wasn't going to say it, and then she said it anyway, because Clara Dunmore was gripping that cup with both hands, and the truth was more useful than comfort. "My daughter died when she was 3, she said. "Fever. I wasn't there. That's the thing I carry." She held Clara's eyes. "I'm not telling you that to frighten you. I'm telling you because I want you to understand that I know what this particular kind of waiting feels like. And I also know that the men out there have found people in worse circumstances and brought them back." She paused. "Cole Hargrove is good at finding things." Clara looked at her. "You trust him?" "I trust him." Something in Clara's face loosened slightly. Not all the way, just enough to let her breathe. They waited together in the kitchen, the 2 of them, Maggie refilling the coffee when it cooled, and Clara talking in fits and starts about Eli, his laugh, the way he'd learned to ride before he could reliably walk, the argument they'd had last week about whether he needed to stay through winter or could ride to Cheyenne for work, which, in retrospect, Clara wished she'd handled differently. "You weren't wrong to say what you said," Maggie told her. "You were being a mother. I was being afraid and calling it sensible." Maggie thought about her own sensible choices and what they'd cost her. "That's what mothers do. It doesn't mean you were wrong." An hour and 40 minutes after the men rode out, Maggie heard horses. She was at the kitchen window before she decided to stand up. Cole's horse came in first, then Boyd, then Cal, and beside Cal, a second horse being led, and on the second horse, a shape that was upright and moving and alive. Clara made a sound that Maggie had never heard before and hoped never to hear again, and was through the kitchen door and across the yard before the horses had fully stopped. Maggie stood in the doorway and watched Eli Dunmore slide down from the horse into his mother's arms. 17 years old, half frozen, limping badly from something he'd done to his right ankle when his horse had shived and thrown him in the dark, but alive and embarrassed about both the falling and the crying he was very unsuccessfully trying not to do while his mother held him. Boyd Denton, who had been the last man she'd expected to be moved by anything, was looking at the ground with the expression of a man who had decided the toe of his boot needed close examination immediately. Cole dismounted and walked to Maggie. "Ankle, not broken. He'd gotten himself into a creek bend and the bank was too steep to climb in the dark with the injury." He looked tired in the bone-deep way of people who'd been cold and moving hard for 2 hours. "He'd have been fine come morning if the cold hadn't—" He stopped. But it didn't. "Come inside," Maggie said. "All of you." She fed them. Of course she did. She fed Eli Dunmore hot broth and bread, and watched the color come back into his face, the way color came back into a room when someone opened a window, gradually, and then all at once. She fed the men who'd ridden out, and the men who'd stayed, and Clara Dunmore, who couldn't eat at first, and then couldn't stop. She kept the stove going and the coffee hot, and let the kitchen do what kitchens were built to do, which was hold people while they came back to themselves. Cole ate last, sitting at the near end of the table after the others had moved to the main room. And Maggie sat across from him without asking, and he didn't tell her not to. "You knew," he said, "about the Ridge Road, about Halloran's man." She shook her head. "I suspected. There's a difference. Eli could have simply gotten thrown, and that could have been the whole story." "Could have been." He looked at his hands. "But you thought about the man who didn't speak, the one with loose hands." "I thought about him, yes. We didn't see anyone on the Ridge Road." He picked up his coffee. "Doesn't mean nobody was there." "No, it doesn't." They sat with that for a moment. 48 hours, Maggie said. "Vic's deadline is tomorrow morning." Cole looked up. "Whatever they're going to do next," she said, "they'll want to do it before the deadline, so it looks like leverage rather than retaliation." She held his gaze. "Cole, is there anything else on this property that someone could reach and damage or threaten without getting close to the main house?" He was quiet for too long. "The cattle on the home range," she said. "You moved them from the north pasture." "Home range is visible from the house. Anyone coming near it at night would be heard." He paused. "But the equipment shed is on the far east side. And there's a storage cache on the ridge where my grandfather kept survey records, original deed documentation, property line maps going back 40 years. He stopped. "If those records were to disappear, then your legal standing on the property line becomes your word against Halloran's documentation." "Yes." Maggie stood up. "Then Hector needs to know, tonight, and someone needs to be at that cache before dark tomorrow." Cole stood. For a moment he looked at her with the full weight of whatever he was thinking. Not the careful closed face, not the underneath of it, but something else entirely. Something that had no armor on it at all. That was simply what it was, without the years of careful management she'd watched him apply to every other human interaction. "Why are you still here?" he said. It was not an accusation. It was a genuine question, asked with genuine bewilderment, the way a man who is expected to be alone asks when he finds he isn't. Maggie thought about Ruth's letter, about the turned soil in the garden plot, about Junior's careful handwriting, and Boyd Denton's embarrassment, and the sound of Cal laughing 2 nights ago at a table that had been silent for too long before she arrived. She thought about Cole's hands, loose at his sides at the gate, with Vic, placing himself slightly in front of her, without meaning her to notice. She thought about Henry Pruitt and her daughter, and 2 people in a cold garden saying the unsayable, and the particular relief of being heard without being fixed. "Because someone needs to be," she said. Cole looked at her for a long moment in the warm kitchen, with the sound of his men in the next room, and Clara Dunmore's voice rising with something that was almost close to laughing, as Eli told some version of the story that was funnier than it had any right to be. Yet then he did something she had not seen him do before. He reached out and took her hand. Not in the manner of a man making a declaration, but in the manner of a man acknowledging a thing that was already there. Careful, certain, without theater. He held it for 5 seconds. Then he let go and put on his hat and went to find Hector. Maggie stood in the kitchen with the warmth on her palm where his hand had been, and listened to the ranch around her. The voices and the fire, and the cattle on the home range, and the Wyoming dark pressing against every window. Whatever was coming in the next 48 hours, it was coming whether she was ready or not. She had learned enough about herself in the last 2 years to know that ready was a condition you created through action, not through waiting. She stoked the fire, checked the locks on the kitchen window, and started planning what she would cook tomorrow, because tomorrow was going to need something in it that tasted like staying. She was up before 4, not because the ranch woke her, not because of a sound on the porch or near the well, but because she had lain in Ruth's narrow bed, listening to the dark, and finally accepted that sleep was not coming, and that lying still pretending otherwise was a waste of the last hours before whatever the day intended to deliver. She built the fire. She measured the coffee. She stood at the kitchen window in the dark and looked at the yard and the barn and the tree line beyond. And she thought about 48 hours and document caches and a man named Vic whose face had moved when she mentioned a well rope. She had the biscuits in the oven and the bacon on when Cole came in at 4:30, which was earlier than his usual time, which told her he hadn't slept either. He poured coffee, stood at the window beside her. "Hector's already up," he said. "He and Boyd rode to the Ridge cache at midnight. Records are still there. Hector's going to stay through the morning." "That's good." "I wrote to my lawyer last night. Everything goes out on the morning stage." He drank. "Clara Dunmore's boy is sleeping in the bunkhouse. She's taking him home after breakfast." "His ankle needs 3 days off it." "I told her that. She said she'd make sure." He looked at the window. "She also said she'd go to the sheriff's office in town and report what happened to Eli, independently of anything I file. 2 separate accounts from 2 separate properties carry more weight than one." "She's smart." "She's been running Anchor alone for 6 years since her husband passed. Smart was a requirement." He turned from the window. "Maggie." She looked at him. "Whatever happens today," he said, "I want you to know that I've already sent a separate letter, not to the lawyer, not to the sheriff." He set his cup down. "To the deed office in Cheyenne, formally documenting your presence on this property as an authorized agent with full knowledge of ranch operations." He held her gaze. "It means that anything you sign or any account you give carries legal standing, same as mine." Maggie looked at him for a long moment. She understood what he was doing. He was building a wall around her the only way he knew how, with paper and law and the careful architecture of a man who had once lost something because he was 2 days short of the right documentation. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know I didn't have to." He picked up his cup. "I wanted to. There's a difference." She turned back to the bacon before her face did something she hadn't given it permission to do. The morning came in gray and bitter, the kind of cold that announced itself in the bones before the skin felt it. And by the time the men had eaten and Clara Dunmore had collected her son, who limped with dignity and thanked Maggie for the broth with the specific formality of a 17-year-old trying to recover his dignity in front of a woman he'd cried in front of the night before, the yard had the feel of a held breath. Boyd Denton came back from the east fence line at 9 and found Maggie in the kitchen. "Rider coming up the Cheyenne Road," he said. "Single horse, not Vic." Maggie wiped her hands. "How far?" 20 minutes. She went to find Cole. He was in the barn with Hector, who had returned from the Ridge cache an hour earlier with the original deed documents in a leather satchel that now sat on the kitchen table under a clean cloth. Cole listened to Boyd, looked at Hector, looked at Maggie. "One rider," Maggie said. "Not Vic means not official. Someone they send alone is either a messenger or a specific kind of problem. Or someone who wants to talk without a witness," Hector said. Cole pulled his coat straight. "Let's go." They met the rider at the gate. He was young, maybe 25, with a face that hadn't settled yet into whatever it was going to be, and a horse that was good quality and recently acquired, which told Maggie he was working for someone who could afford to equip him properly. He had an envelope in his hand, and he held it out to Cole before he'd fully stopped the horse. "From Mr. Aldous Vick," the rider said. "He asked me to wait for a response." Cole looked at the envelope, looked at Maggie. She took it, opened it, read it. It was half a page. Direct language, no preamble. Halloran Land Partners was withdrawing the 48-hour deadline. They were extending a final courtesy period of 2 weeks. During this period, they would be prepared to discuss modified terms. They wished Mr. Hargrove to understand that this extension was a gesture of goodwill and not a retreat from their position. Maggie read it twice. Then she understood what it was. "They heard from someone," she said quietly. "Between yesterday and this morning, something changed. They're pulling back." Cole looked at the letter. The sheriff. Or the deed office. Or both. She folded the letter. "Someone in Cheyenne told them you were filing and documenting, and they've decided that open pressure is no longer their best approach." She looked at the rider. "Tell Mr. Vick that Mr. Hargrove received his letter and will respond through his legal counsel in Cheyenne." The rider looked at Cole for confirmation. Cole nodded once. The rider left. Hector exhaled slowly. "It's not over." "No," Maggie said. "It's not over. It's just moved somewhere less visible. That's different from finished." She looked at Cole. "But it means they're not coming today. And it means the documentation is working." Cole looked down the road where the rider had gone, and his jaw worked in the particular way she'd learned meant he was processing something he hadn't decided the shape of yet. Then he looked at her. "Come with me," he said. "I want to show you something." She followed him up through the yard, past the barn, up the path behind the equipment shed that rose gradually toward the north ridge. The ground was frozen hard, and her boots found purchase on the gravel easily, and Cole walked with the ease of a man who had made this climb hundreds of times, though she noticed he slowed his pace without appearing to slow it, which she had begun to understand was a thing he did without thinking. They reached the ridge in 10 minutes. The view from the top stopped her. She had grown up in Wyoming, and she had ridden through country that could stop a person's breath with its size. But this was different because this was specific. This was Copper Ridge Ranch, spread below like a working map of itself. The barn, and the house, and the cookhouse, and the bunkhouse, and the garden plot she'd been breaking soil in. All of it, small and orderly and real, in the way that only things people have actually built with their hands are real. And beyond it, the valley. And beyond that, the mountains, with the first snow catching the thin morning light. And threading through the middle distance, the faint line of what would one day be a railroad grade. She stood and looked at it for a long time. "My grandfather stood here the first time in 1841, Cole said. He was looking at the valley, not at her. He'd been riding for 9 days out of Missouri, and he came up over this ridge, and he said he knew immediately. He wrote about it in his journal. Said it felt like the land was asking him a question, and he already knew the answer." What was the question? Cole turned and looked at her. "Are you willing to fight for this?" Maggie looked out at the ranch below, at the smoke coming from the kitchen she'd cleaned and stocked and cooked in every day for a week. At the men moving between the barn and the pasture, in the easy rhythm of people who knew their purpose in a place. At Junior crossing the yard with a bucket and talking to Boyd Denton, who was walking the other direction. And somehow, they were both walking and talking and not running into each other. The particular choreography of people who had learned to share a space and found they didn't mind it. "Yes," she said. Not to Cole, to the land, to Ruth's letter in her pocket, to herself. Cole heard it anyway. "Stay," he said. Simply, the way he said everything. No theater, no performance, just the word placed directly where it needed to go. Not for the weak, not for the debt. Stay because this place needs what you bring to it, and because I think you know it. And I think that's been true since the second morning when you sat across from me at that table and made yourself look at what was in the ledger instead of what was easier." Maggie kept looking at the valley. Her hands were in her coat pockets, and she pressed them flat against her thighs, and breathed the cold air in through her nose, and thought about the word stay, and all the years she'd spent treating it like a threat. "I told you I was bad at staying," she said. "You told me you were out of practice." He was quiet for a moment. "There's a difference." She turned and looked at him standing on his grandfather's ridge in the cold morning, with the document satchel metaphorically still warm from the night before, and the letter from Vic in her pocket, and 8 years of carried guilt in his eyes that had not gone away, but had shifted somehow in the days since the garden, moved from the center of him to somewhere less load-bearing. She thought about her daughter. She thought about the small grave in Nevada she hadn't visited in 2 years, because visiting meant staying in one place long enough to feel it. And feeling it meant admitting it was real. And admitting it was real meant accepting that the world had continued turning after it happened, which was the part she had never fully forgiven the world for. "I haven't visited her grave," she said. "Emma, my daughter." The name came out the way it always came out when she let it. Bigger than the word itself, like the word was too small a container for what it held. "I've been moving so long, I told myself it was because I couldn't get back to Nevada. That's not true. I could have gotten back. I chose roads that didn't go there." Cole was still. "I think I need to go," she said. "Before spring. I need to go to Nevada and stand at that grave and say what I should have said 2 years ago." She looked at him. "And then I need to come back." He let the silence sit with that for a moment, the way he let silences sit with things. "I'll still be here," he said. "I know you will." She managed something that was almost a smile. "You're too stubborn to be anywhere else." The not-quite smile crossed his face. More of it this time. Enough to count. They came back down the ridge together and walked into the yard, and the ordinary business of a working ranch morning closed around them like water around two people who had stepped back into a current. Junior calling out something from the equipment shed. Hector coming from the barn with a look that asked and received a reassurance in 2 exchanged glances. The smell of the kitchen fire and the sound of cattle, and the particular quality of light at mid-morning in Wyoming that was thin and clean, and asked nothing of you except to be present in it. And Maggie was present, fully, without the 1 foot already pointed toward the door that had been her mode for 2 years. Both feet on the ground of Copper Ridge Ranch, which was frozen and real, and hers, in the way that things become yours, not through ownership, but through the investment of care. The afternoon brought Della Marsh. Maggie was in the garden when the wagon came, and she stayed in the garden and let it come. She heard Cole come out of the barn, and she heard their voices, quieter than usual, the particular register of a conversation that was handling something delicate. She kept working the soil, and she did not try to listen, and she did not try not to listen. After about 10 minutes, she heard the wagon move. She looked up. Cole was walking toward her. He stopped at the edge of the garden plot. "I told her the truth," he said. "All of it?" "Enough of it." He looked at the turned soil. "She was kinder about it than I deserved. She said she'd known since the first morning I didn't meet her at the gate when she arrived." "When was that?" "The Tuesday after you got here." Maggie looked at the spade in her hands. She thought about Tuesday. She'd been in the kitchen reorganizing the pantry on Tuesday morning. She remembered because she'd found the jar of sorghum behind the saddle oil, and she'd told Junior to look closer next time before declaring a shelf empty. "She's a good woman," Maggie said. She is. Cole looked at the garden. She said to tell you that the apple preserves were the best she'd had in 10 years, and she'd like the recipe if you were willing to share it. Maggie felt the specific tightness in her chest release by one small degree. Tell her to come by next week. I'll show her how to put them up. Cole nodded. He stayed at the edge of the garden for a moment longer, not speaking, just present. And Maggie understood that this was what he did when he was somewhere he decided to be. He occupied it fully and without apology. And she thought that was possibly the quality of his she admired most. This capacity for uncomplicated presence in a place. There's something else I need to tell you, he said. She waited. The letter I sent to the deed office, documenting your position here. He paused. I also wrote something else, a separate document. It's not legal yet. It would need witnesses and a notary. But I wrote it so you could read it and tell me if it's what you want. He reached into his coat and held out a folded paper. It's a co-management agreement. Not ownership, not yet, but a formal partnership in the operation of this ranch. Decision-making, financial authority, full standing. Maggie did not take the paper immediately. Cole, you found the overcharging on the cornmeal. You read Vic's contract in the cold in 3 minutes and found what would have cost me this ranch. You planned the supply system that's already saving us money we need. He held the paper steady. You told me guilty carried too long stops being useful. I'm applying that to pride. Read it. She took the paper. She read it the way she read everything, carefully, with attention to every word. It was 3 pages in Cole's handwriting, precise and unexpectedly formal. The handwriting of a man who had spent years writing federal case reports and had never quite lost the habit. The terms were fair, more than fair. They were the terms of a man who was not trying to acquire something, but to acknowledge something that was already there. She read to the last line. At the bottom, below the formal language, in smaller handwriting that was different from the rest. Less formal. Written after, she could tell by the slightly different ink, were 6 words. I would like you to stay, not as a legal provision, not as a term of the agreement. Just 6 words that had apparently needed to be said in addition to all the other words, because all the other words hadn't said the right thing. Maggie looked at those 6 words for a long time. Then she looked up at Cole Hargrove, standing at the edge of the garden she'd been breaking soil in for a future she'd started believing in against her better judgment. And she thought about Ruth's letter, and a daughter named Emma, and a knife in a table, and 3 days hard riding through October cold for reasons she'd told herself were duty, and had known from the first morning were something more than that. I'll need a pen, she said. Cole reached into his coat and produced one with the air of a man who had hoped this would be the response and prepared accordingly. Maggie signed her name at the bottom of the page. Margaret Ann Holden, in full, the way you sign things you intended to mean. Cole signed beneath it. They stood with the paper between them in the cold garden, and the ranch breathing around them in every direction. And Junior chose this moment to come around the corner of the equipment shed at full speed, skid to a stop when he saw them, look at the paper, look at their faces, and say with the complete unself-conscious accuracy of a person who had not yet learned to be tactful about the truth. Is that what I think it is? Go find something to do, Junior, Cole said. I just finished everything Hector gave me. Then find Hector and tell him I said to think of something else. Junior went, but not before grinning with his whole face in the unguarded way he had, and they heard him say something to Boyd Denton halfway across the yard, and Boyd Denton respond with something that sounded like, finally, and Cole made the exhale through the nose that was his version of a laugh. Maggie folded the signed agreement. Supper, she said. What? I need to start supper." She handed him the folded paper. "Put that somewhere safe. And tell Hector I need someone to bring up the last of the root vegetables, because I'm making something tonight that requires the good onions." Cole took the paper and held it with the particular care of a man holding a thing that matters. "What are you making?" "Something that smells like someone gives a damn." She picked up her spade. "There should be a fiddle tonight. Tell Junior to find whoever had it last week." Cole looked at her. The full, underneath face, nothing managed, nothing careful. Just what was there when the years of weight had been shifted to one side, long enough for the actual man to stand in the light. "Maggie," he said. She turned. "Thank you." He said it simply. "For coming. For staying. For the third page of Vic's contract, and the supply list, and the garden, and every other thing." He paused. "For making this place sound like it has people in it again." Maggie looked at him standing on his grandfather's land, with his grandfather's deed in a satchel in the house behind him, and his grandfather's question still being answered after 40 years of Hargrove's answering it. And she thought about what it meant to fight for something, not because you had no other choice, but because you had looked at all the choices available to you, and this one was worth more than your fear of losing it. "Ruth knew," she said. "She knew this is where I needed to be." Smart woman. The smartest. She looked at the kitchen window, the curtain she'd hung, the warm light behind it. She always said food was just the reason people sat down. The sitting down was the real thing. Cole looked at the kitchen too. She used to say a table full of people eating was the only honest picture of a community there was. You couldn't fake hunger, and you couldn't fake being fed. She said the same thing to me, almost word for word. Maggie's throat tightened in the good way, the way that meant something was real rather than lost. She must have believed it. She lived it. He put the signed agreement inside his coat, against his chest, where it would stay warm. Every single day she was here. That evening, Maggie cooked the way she cooked when she was cooking for keeps. Everything on the stove tended with the full weight of her attention, the flavors built in layers, nothing rushed, nothing careless. The kitchen smelled like the best version of itself. Hector came in twice, once for coffee and once for no reason she could identify except that he wanted to be in the room, which she had come to understand was his way of saying something that he would never say directly. The men came to the table, and the room was loud before anyone had even sat down. And Cal made a joke, and Boyd Denton laughed first, which was still surprising enough that Junior pointed at him, and Boyd told Junior to mind his own business. And somewhere in the middle of the meal, Cole looked across the table at Maggie, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed saying that wasn't already present in every person at that table and every sound in that room. After supper, Junior found the fiddle. He played badly and with tremendous enthusiasm, which turned out to be the exact right combination for a room full of men who needed music more than they needed it to be good. And Cal sang something that was probably a hymn in its original form, but had been altered in transit to something considerably less reverent. And Boyd Denton, to the visible shock of everyone present, knew all the words. Maggie stood in the kitchen doorway and listened. She thought about the roads she'd taken for 2 years to avoid standing still. She thought about Nevada and the small grave she would visit in the spring, before the ground thawed and the planting started. And she thought about coming back to this kitchen after, about the specific relief of having somewhere particular to come back to. She thought about 6 words in slightly different ink at the bottom of a signed agreement. She thought about staying. Not the way she'd thought about it before, as a thing other people did, a risk she couldn't afford, a vulnerability she'd closed off the day Emma died and Thomas left, and the world proved beyond reasonable doubt that everything she built would be taken from her one way or another. She thought about it the way a person thinks about a thing they have already decided, not weighing it, not hedging it, not building an exit before they'd finished building the door, just the plain fact of it. The warm kitchen, and the fiddle, and the signed paper against Cole Hargrove's chest, and the Wyoming winter pressing against every window of a ranch that was still standing because the people in it had decided it was worth the fight. She thought about Ruth, who had sent her here, knowing exactly what she was sending her into, who had understood that her niece needed a place that would need her back, and had been right, had been exactly right, had known Maggie better than Maggie had known herself, which was the particular genius of women who love you enough to tell you the truth in a letter they know you won't read until they're gone. Outside, the wind came down off the ridge clean and cold, and the stars over Wyoming were the kind of absolute that made every other sky feel like an approximation. Copper Ridge Ranch held its ground in the dark the way it had always held its ground, not because nothing had ever threatened it, but because the people on it had made a repeated decision, one morning at a time, one meal at a time, one signed page at a time, to stay and fight and build something that deserved to last. Maggie turned back to her kitchen, banked the fire for the night, and hung her apron on the hook by the window where Ruth had always hung hers. She was home, and she was staying, and that was the whole truth of it, plain and final and more than enough.